one of the advantages of being 75 years old is I can say, in my day, such and such and such and such. And the in my day is not just the 1960s. The formative period for me was the 50s. And I was born in the 40s. I was born during World War II. So I remember a very different US. Very, very different. And I know we look out and we see lots of problems, sources of frustration, and so forth. Sure. There's also, however, the extraordinary shift that has occurred that I never in my wildest dreams would have thought could occur. The US of my formative years was a culture that looked eternal. I assumed things would be essentially the same when I'm 75 years old as when I was 5 years old. So when I was 5 years old, who was president? Eisenhower? I think so. So that's what I thought, that's the way I thought it would always be. The notion that what is essentially an import from Asia would fundamentally impact broad aspects of North American culture is completely off the charts. Unthinkable that anything like that would happen. So for me, because I compare to my youth, what we're doing here, what I do every day, what thousands of people are doing around the world every day with this practice, this is miraculous. It's still miraculous for me. I wanted to show you this very cool book. I think it's a cool book now. I thought it was monstrous when I was 15 years old. This book is emblematic of the way things used to be vis-a-vis this practice, not all that long ago. So this book is by Ernest Becker, who it turns out was actually not a small figure. He made later in his career some substantial contributions to the field of psychology. But he launched his literary career with this book, Zen, A Rational Critique. Based on essentially no knowledge whatsoever of Zen, but a desire perhaps to make a name or create a straw man that's easy to attack, or what have you. He writes this book. Now let's see here. I read this book and it devastated me when I was a teenager, just devastated me. Let's see here. What's the date? 1961. Haha. So let's see what this book says. This is 1961. Oops, sorry about that. Without this, I won't read it. The appeal of Zen to a variety of Westerners, both dilettantes and professionals, has been increasingly, and to some, has been increasingly evident, and to some has become a matter of concern. Appeal of Zen is a matter of concern. In 1961. Zen typifies an Eastern approach to problem solving that is the opposite pole of the Western ideals. The human being, puppet-like, manipulates himself in the hope of coercing his environment. Steeped in a tradition of magical omnipotence, the Zenist seeks to bring otherworldly power to bear upon this worldly problems. To this question, does Zen hold forth anything of value to the West? This book makes an unremitting negative answer. And it goes on and on and on and on about how the practice that we do is essentially a form of mental illness. So this is a book written by a doctor, and doctors have authority. And this was a book written before these kinds of practices were widespread. So I'm 15 years old, I picked this thing up. Or however old I am. So, I was young, and it's like, oh my God, all this stuff I'm interested in is all bullshit. Why? A doctor says so. Took me a long time to recover from that. That's why I love this so much now, because of the sweet revenge. The sweet revenge. We who are but of yesterday are now in all your therapy rooms and your boardrooms and your military training camps and you name it. So big shift, really. The notion that not only is this not superstition, magic, and complete world-denying nonsense, not only is it not that, which people said it was in my lifetime, important people, turns out that there's a natural complementarity, a kind of natural co-evolution where the strengths of modern science and the strengths of contemplative practice can reinforce each other. And the weaknesses and dangers in each can perhaps be ameliorated and managed by the influence of the other. So yesterday I outlined 4 concepts, and if you know how to unpack these concepts, you'll have a sense of what a science-informed, contemplative-based psycho-spiritual path can look like. So you'll recall, develop the skills, optimize the happy. We talked about techniques, and you get a lot of instruction in technique. But we also talked about the training structure wherein those techniques are implemented. Retreat practice, life practice, get support, give support. We harp on these structures, establishing and maintaining them for the lifetime to at least a minimal degree. We talked about that. Another part that I alluded to, but I'd like to just fill out a little more detail, is the accelerators. So you have to have the pillars. Without the pillars, you're not going to have a practice. People will say, okay, well, are there things that can help speed it along? The practice, the progress, and yes, I would say so. We talk about this all the time, but I just wanted to mention it within the context of the online retreat that we're now doing. So one of the accelerators is, you could call it duration training, strong determination sit, adipana, yuza, sometimes we call it heroic sitting. So extending the duration of your sit in a gentle way, but understanding that eventually every one of us will have sits with no bell. I mean, guaranteed at the end of life, but also stuff happens where you just are sort of at the end of your rope. It's going to happen. Circumstances will arise. And knowing that there is an ordering principle that is so primordial that it can never be disordered, no matter what state arises in mind, body, and outer world in terms of sensory impact. You can still be ordered, you can still be okay. It may not be a human ordering, but it is an ordering principle that we can abide in and merge with, that connects us to everything. And one of the ways that we learn about that is by sitting as though we weren't going to get up. It's a kind of attitude. Of course, we're going to get up, but each sit, at least the way my teachers taught me, each sit should be like, I'm not going to get up. What if there's no bell? That's how I should be sitting now. So you're always aiming at finding happiness independent of conditions at the most industrial strength level. So one way to learn about that, you don't want to damage the body. I've written and spoken quite a bit about this. You can read about it or talk to the coaches, facilitators, and so forth. But no, you don't damage the body, but you push the envelope with sensations. And if you have a situation where sitting is not good for you objectively, there's all sorts of other postures you can hold. There's qigong stuff, you know, where you hold your arms out, up, you squat. These are standard famous practices done all over China to this day. Doesn't necessarily have to be that the posture that you break through is a seated one, because sometimes our bodies can be damaged by very long sits, but these other postures are innocuous, although they can be very intense. So extending the duration, and also extending the duration of a period of practice does not necessarily have to be seated. I used to sometimes do 6-hour practice periods without a scintilla of motion, but I would do them lying down. I'd get very comfortable, in fact, very comfortable, like under the, the blankie, but I'd drink a lot of espresso before, so I'd be sure to easily stay awake. And then I would relax into a corpse posture that was as corpse-like still as I could muster, and then just try, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, just not move a muscle. And just work through that duration. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, duration training is not necessarily about dealing with discomforts. It's about extending how long you can maintain quality, unbroken formal practice through various kinds of situations. So here in this situation, we can still do that, and you have the convenience of your own home, so that you can decide, am I going to do a 2-hour block, going to do a 4-hour block, before dinner, etc. And other people will be in the Zendo. Now, when we have these things live, Cho, I actually have a question to you. When I was thinking about this talk, at the retreats, we have people designate themselves as yuza, sort of heroes, that, okay, I'm going to do this 4-hour block every day or something like that. I'm wondering, maybe we could set something like that up.
Yeah, we never translated that, but we do have virtual sit leaders doing half-day shifts. So sort of their yuza, like this afternoon, Nokoya started at 3 and she finishes at 10. So it's
right. Sort of that. Yeah, it was just a thought that occurred to me. Someone could say,
we'll translate
that. Today, it's maybe under their picture or something, and it's like, this is a 4-hour, sit, and then other people who would be joining that sit might have that inspiration in front of them, etc., like we do in the physical retreats. I don't know, this is just a stray thought that occurred to me as I was thinking about things that might be helpful at the retreat.
Okay.
So that's a way of pushing the envelope, duration training. Then there's trigger practice, where you expose yourself to sights and sounds and touches that may create states, and then you apply a technique. The technique doesn't have to be a turn towards it technique. It doesn't have to be focus in necessarily. It could be any technique. So I'm thinking in the practice at home situation that we're in now, there's also a lot of dimensions and directions where you could set up trigger practice. It might be actually more diversity and flexibility in the home situation. So once again, just something to consider. If you have questions about, if you don't know what we mean by trigger practice, once again, the teaching staff will explain that to you. So I'm thinking we can incorporate that into the online retreats in maybe some imaginative ways, and then maybe we'd get some reports on how that worked. Most specifically, motion challenge sequence. Usually at retreats, this takes the form of just walking practice, or maybe the seva tasks that are done at retreats. But in your home, you have, once again, a wider range of ordinary life activities that you can attempt to stay deep with a technique whilst engaging. So yeah, you can walk around, but you can walk around in different places. You can walk in your backyard, but maybe you walk through the neighborhood. That's a different experience. But also you can putter around the house. You can really do Chan, Zen style, karma yoga kinds of things. Try washing the dishes, try sweeping the yard, try even cooking a meal maybe, maintaining a certain technique with a certain goal in mind. So once again, I think it will be interesting to explore the broader opportunities for motion challenge. Here's another thing. This is a little bit on the more esoteric side, but some of you are familiar with the auto speak. We often do it in a very stereotyped way in the form of auto chant in the retreats, the residential retreats. But auto speak has, if you're familiar with it, you know that it has more interesting forms of practice. For example, you can arrange with another person to practice speaking from an unfixated place. They know that you might be a little awkward because you're trying to let it self-organize. So you speak from auto, but actually have a human conversation, then they speak from auto. You could do that with another person at the retreat or with someone over the phone, etc. So once again, there are possibilities for other ways of practicing that we don't have so conveniently in the residential situation. So trigger practice, duration training, motion challenge sequence. And then the final accelerator is not actually like those other three. It's an attitude thing, but it's very important. It's an attitude about situations. So one aspect of happiness is getting situations to be the way we would like them to be. In fact, that's the first item on the happiness grid, because that's the first thing most people think about. If there's a situation I don't want, let's change that situation, get rid of it. If there's a situation I do want, let's do what we need to do to make that happen. This practice is very relevant to situational happiness because of the general principle, what goes around comes around. If we act effectively as the result of having done this practice, then there's not the guarantee, but there's the higher likelihood, and indeed the strong statistical force that in the long run, we're part of the force, the better angels of this planet. So we want to act effectively and certainly not be indifferent to situations. But situation practice as an accelerator is a little different aspect of it. It encompasses our actions for the situation, but it's a broader framework. The broader framework is, broadly speaking, how am I going to use this situation to as an expression of my practice. So if by situation, I mean various levels of scale. So a situation can be very private, very individual. What's happening with my, boil today that I have on my leg. That's a situation, a very local situation. Then there's this person in my life or that thing in my career. And then there's what's happening in the neighborhood, what's happening in the country, what's happening in the world, et cetera, et cetera. All of the above are situations, various scales of situations. So if we approach each situation with a clear strategy for how we want to grow with this, how we're going to use this as an expression of practice. Essentially, that monasticizes life. You might say that one of the reasons in the old days people went off to monasteries, and actually they still do even nowadays, although it's not nearly as prevalent as it was at one time. At one time, East and West, the cultures were completely monastic. Now, definitely not that, but one of the reasons people go to monasteries is not to get away from things, but to be forced to confront things. So the householder's practice, where we're not off in a monastery, what monasticizes the day, what turns the householder's life into a monastic effect, among other things, one important thing is, okay, sure, this is good, this is bad, we need to do this, we should have done that, all of that. But also, how am I using this situation to optimize my ability to be part of the solution and take measures. And we do have to take measures because it's very, very easy to fall into the problem of becoming part of the problem by the way that we try to solve the problem. It happens over and over and over again. So thinking about situations of all types and all scales as they come up for us, having some sense of, okay, here's how the practice relates, here's how the practice relates. This monasticizes the householder's life. So these are the accelerators. So if you establish the pillars, and then you strengthen things with the accelerators, then we're going to be in good shape, big picture wise. So that was some of the sort of logistical things that, or practical things that I wanted to make sure we covered. I thought it might be fun to have a little bit of poetry in addition to my sort of highly organized prose with so many charts and so forth. So hold it just a second. I have the an actual printed book, the collected poems of TS Eliot. It says 1909 to 1962. So I didn't really prepare. Let me see if I can find something. Ah, there we go. That might be an interesting place to start. So I don't know much about the field of poetry, but I've had a lifelong fascination with one poet, and not just any poet, but the poet universally thought of as the creator of modern English poetry. So 20th century, which is where I lived mostly, 20th century was, English poetry was dominated by T.S. Eliot. And I think for good reason. I'm not going to give you a lecture on English literature, but I think there's good reason for that. You may mostly know Eliot from his dramatic works. Murder in the Cathedral is one, but also Cats. I'm pretty sure that the big Broadway hit show Cats is based on a work by Eliot. So he did things in the drama area, particularly later in life, and was also influential in the theory of literary criticism in the 20th century. But it's his poetry that mostly attracts me, because his last statement, at least the way I look upon it, he wrote many other poems, but I think if we look at the arc of this person's development, where he started and where he ended with his poetry, it's really emblematic of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the Western world in the 20th century. That's quite extraordinary, really. So where he ended, most of you know this, maybe all of you know this because I use it a lot. Where he ended was the Four Quartets, which is many things, as the name implies. It's more than 4 voices. And each of the 4 sections has many subsections. So there are many, many things in that poem. But the most important voice, the deepest voice, And the voice that hardly any of the literary critics who gave him a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948 even heard. They didn't even hear the really important voice in the Four Quartets. The really important voice is the Four Quartets is a east-west, mostly west, poetic manual for the awkward intermediate zone in contemplative practice. There can be actually many awkward intermediate stages that we go through. In fact, that's one way to look at what a lifetime of practice is. One acclimatization after another, of from an in-between zone that was not enough, in the sense that the old coping mechanism that sort of works could be epitomized, characterized by the phrase, tighten up and turn away. The new coping mechanism that this practice gives us could be described as open up and turn towards. You can see these are diametric opposites. So it's difficult to avoid awkward intermediate steps where the old coping mechanism has been somewhat shed, but the new coping mechanism is not mature enough to fully deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that come to us from the outer world and the percolations of poison and pain that well up from the inner. So there can be awkward intermediate stages that we have to go through in terms of emotions, but also in terms of what I call integration. This is just a term that I've been using recently for something specific. I mean, obviously, this whole path is integration, but specifically, how do we integrate nothingness, no self, emptiness, borderless, de-centered being? How do we integrate that into something that is humanly fulfilling and objectively admirable in the world? How do you integrate, how do you use nothing in the service of everything? It would seem like nothing would be in the service of nothing. It would seem if the goal of this practice is no self and emptiness, that this practice is not a good idea. Who wants that? And yet we know, counterintuitively, all over the world, East, West, ancient and modern, often without any mutual contact, the people that have followed this path have come to talk about a very special kind of nothing. So how is that in service of, how is the one nothing in service of the 10,000 somethings we need to take care of as a human being? Integrating the void into a fulfilling and effective human manifestation. Some people can do it without any difficulty at all. It just happens. They drink the void and it more or less cures their ills. And they don't need any integration training. Other people need integration training. They need some help, some guidelines. It's one of the reasons why we give you the Feel Great family right at the beginning. Feel res, feel flow, feel bounce, feel good. These are all useful for integrating emptiness down the line. So in any event, the Four Quartets, the last one starts, midwinter spring is its own season. So midwinter spring, right? In between. Midwinter spring is its own season. Sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic. Midwinter spring is its own season, so time, but an in-between time, in between summer and, I'm sorry, in between winter and spring. But there's also the in-between time between the winter of humanity's childhood and the spring and summer of what I believe will be our maturity, our adulthood as a species. Eliot was a conservative Christian, theologically. So he had a view of history, which is that at some point in the future, history is going to take care of itself. That would also be the summer, the second coming. I believe he was well beyond the mythological version of Christianity, but that's neither here nor there. Midwinter spring could be the individual practitioner's state of gone halfway with this practice. It could be humanity's state of gone halfway to what we're supposed to be, either from a purely scientific Darwinian point of view, or hey, if you want to sort of go archetypal like Eliot, link it to a religion, fine. And of course, then there's the just the season between, he's describing the countryside in England at a certain time of year. Hold it just a second. That actually wasn't the poem I was going to read, but since I started it, I better find it. Little Gidding, yipes, 200, okay. Oh, opened right to it. Maybe I can read this. Midwinter spring is its own season. Sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown. What does that mean? Sempiternal is not a common word. You might have heard it. It means what it sounds like. It seems as though it's going to last forever. It's half eternal. So sempiternal, seeming to last all day or forever, yet sodden towards sundown. But at the end of the day, we're back to the wet of winter. So a day that could seem to last forever, but really is impermanent. Suspended in time, this is a great line, suspended in time between pole and tropic. he's mixing time and space, isn't he? He's treating space-time as one thing, the same way Einstein did. I have no idea if he knew that that was the case, if it's just a coincidence. Maybe he knew something about general relativity. It was certainly was in the air at that time. Suspended in time between pole and tropic. So the polar regions are cold, the tropical regions are warm. So you have the warm and the cold. So the time and place are being completely woven together, space-time as a single thing, to be both appreciated and transcended, actually. Midwinter spring is its own season, sempiternal, though sodden toward sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic, when the short day is brightest with frost and fire. The brief sun flames the ice on pond and ditches. In windless cold, that is the heart's heat, reflecting in a watery mirror, a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon. Sorry, I sometimes lose my composure a little bit. A glare that is blindness in the early afternoon. What is the early afternoon here? What is the glare that is blindness? Well, on one hand, it's just the sun doing its thing at this time of year. But there's these weird words, windless cold, that is the heart's heat reflecting in a watery mirror, a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon. Now, the early afternoon is our early afternoon, the early afternoon of our practice, and for Eliot, also the early afternoon of humanity, given how he would have viewed what our future should be. What is this watery mirror? Well, it's the water on the surface of the ice that's somewhat melted, but a watery mirror is an imperfect vehicle of reflection. There's distortion, and yet it is a mirror. Some of you may be familiar with Buddhist notion of the five, of the great wisdom, the great mirror wisdom. There's these five wisdoms, and one is called Da Yuan Man Jing Zhi, the great complete mirror wisdom in Chinese. So this is also a metaphor for the wisdom function of the teenage meditator. A little bit of the wisdom function is arising in your midwinter spring of your practice, but it's still a watery mirror. It's not crystal clear. And the blindness that he is talking about the glare that blinds you, is a direct reference to the Christian contemplative tradition, what's known as taboric illumination, T-A-B-O-R-I-C. What a great word. We need to use that word in ordinary conversations more frequently. Taboric. It means referring to Mount Tabor. Har Tavor in Hebrew. Joshin and I have been there. We've run retreats there, actually. And it features prominently in the New Testament, specifically the Transfiguration. That's where the Church of the Transfiguration is. And what happened there, according to the story, is Jesus was there with some of his disciples. By the way, it's called a mountain, but believe me, it's just a little hill, but a very important hill in the history of Western spirituality. Iconic, actually. So what happened was Jesus was there with some of the disciples, and he just rose up into the sky. Moses is on one hand, Elijah on the other, and there's this light that just knocks everyone on the ground. All the disciples are just basically physically knocked down by this radiance that's sort of illuminating, transfiguring Jesus and the two made prophets from the Old Testament. Great art, great iconic. That light, the blinding light, was called Taboric illumination. We know about it, of course, from Eastern practices, where it's called the clear light of the void. Some of you have experienced it. It can come during the night or during sitting practice. If you've ever experienced it, you know it is quite intense. But even just the see rest, the grayscale blank is a beginning of a hint of that. So Eliot is talking about that also. In other words, he's describing England in a certain season, but he's describing the mid-practice point where you might be after 20, 30 years of practice. In terms of, yeah, we're along, but we still have a very long way to go. Midwinter spring is its own season. Sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic, when the short day is brightest with frost and fire, the brief sun flames the ice on pond and ditches. In windless cold, that is the heart's heat, reflecting in a watery mirror, a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon, and a glow more intense than blaze of branch or brazier stirs the dumb spirit. No wind, but Pentecostal fire in the dark time of the year. Between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. This is the springtime, but not in time's covenant. Now, the hedgerow is blanched for an hour with transitory blossom of snow. Of snow, a bloom more sudden than that of summer, neither budding nor fading, not in the scheme of generation. That light was called the ungenerated light of the source, not in the scheme of generation. Between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. There is no earth smell or smell of living thing. This is the springtime, but not in time's covenant. Now, the hedgerow is blanched for an hour with transitory blossom of snow, a bloom more sudden than that of summer, neither budding nor fading, not in the scheme of generation. Where is the summer, the unimaginable zero summer?